Hi, everyone. I'll also be showing some diameter distributions that show some changes in tan oak, and you'll see we have pretty vigorous sprouting, so that was an interesting comparison to make with the previous presentation. My research does take place in Big Sur, though, a little bit further south, so the southern extent of the Redwoods. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, cool, fantastic. Can't tell up here. So, as many of you know, and I'm sure are well acquainted with, disturbance is an important component of forest ecosystem health and function, and there's resilience mechanisms at work throughout forest ecosystems that help them to maintain function and maintain some sort of semblance to previous structure and composition following disturbance. So, with projections with things like increases in fire disturbance frequency and intensity in the future, ecosystems like Redwood start to, I guess, as ecological researchers, we begin to wonder what kind of implications this is going to have for long-term resilience, long-term regeneration, and these sorts of things. And so one way to think of this is through the sort of lens or the framework of compounding disturbances, which, if you're familiar with recent research in this area, we are sort of, last 5 or 10 years or so, have come to an understanding that when disturbances interact in space and time, so they overlap in one way or another, there can be a significant increase in things like mortality in a forest. So there's research in the Redwoods that corroborates this and shows it, and I'll discuss it in a minute. But sort of previous to that understanding, we may have thought of disturbances a little bit more in an additive sense. So perhaps 2 fires occur and they happen in some sort of closely related in time and space, but previously we might have thought of them as more like disturbance A creates X mortality, disturbance B creates X mortality, and we can sort of think of those as just the sum of their parts. We're understanding more and more, though, that that isn't really the case, and it's not a realistic representation of how ecosystems work. And so with these sorts of compounding disturbances, we are wondering what future resilience looks like, what future regeneration looks like, and ultimately what recovery will be like in the future. So for these types of questions, we're getting at how long does recovery take following one or more disturbances, and what kind of legacies does a disturbance leave behind, good or bad. So for my research, we mentioned soil legacies at the very beginning of this presentation, but I consider below-ground legacies or below-ground imprints of disturbance. So for soils, for example, we'll be looking at things like structure of the soil or changes to nutrient composition. Above ground, you might have something like downed woody debris or standing snags, things like this. So there's a variety of different ways that we can look at the legacies of disturbance and also kind of consider what implications they have in the future. So the overarching question for this research, I'm working on my master's degree, by the way, so this sort of is one of the overarching questions that our lab more broadly has in different forest ecosystems, but we're curious how compounding disturbances influence forest trajectories and disturbance, or rather resilience. And by trajectories, I mean the structure of forests, the composition of forests. Specifically, we're asking how do disturbances change soil legacies or create soil legacies in Big Sur. That's something that we don't really understand all that well in terms of perhaps like a nutrient profile sort of understanding. Do they vary over time? And then, of course, what kind of impact do they have on regeneration of redwood and other species, things that can ultimately impact the way that these forests look X number of years after one or more disturbances take place. And, of course, we're all together in this room for a reason. I don't need to sell you all on studying the redwood forest itself. It's majestic, it's gorgeous, and there's many interesting processes taking place. Obviously, as we heard this morning, there are many cultural and economic reasons to invest in redwoods in the long term and to understand them better. But from a scientific perspective, there's also many, I guess I would say, gathering trends and gathering research that has made them a very good study species for looking at the effects of disturbance in the long term. So Margaret Metz, for example, and some other colleagues showed in 2013 that redwood mortality increases significantly following a compounding disturbance, and that was when sudden oak death came into a forest stand and fire followed up shortly thereafterward. Redwood mortality was much higher than if the fire had come through and there was no sort of pre-existing sudden oak death disturbance in those areas. Redwood is also one of many species predicted to, or one of many ecosystems predicted to have an increase in fire frequency in the near or medium future. So together, these sort of make redwood a fantastic species for looking at these changing disturbance regimes. So as I mentioned, my research is a little bit further south than some of the other work we've heard about. I work specifically with stands at Pfeiffer Big Sur State Park and UCSC Big Creek Reserve. We are in the sort of southern area of Big Sur. And for reference, you can sort of see on the map there, they're about 15 miles apart from one another. What we've done is to look at 4 different, essentially, disturbance histories in Big Sur, and initially, for reference, we were trying to get all the way up to the northern extent of the Redwood Range for my master's research, and we quickly found that that was not feasible for one student in the course of 2 summers. So things have changed slightly, and we're working within a more limited framework here. But working with site managers here, we've outlined some areas that we think have an interesting history and are worth looking into. So we have a burn that occurred in 1985. At Big Creek, an area that was burned in 85 and again in 1999 at Big Creek, so we consider that a compounding disturbance, sort of that those two took place close enough temporally that we can kind of consider them as having interacting effects. At Pfeiffer, we have an area burned in 2008 and then an additional one in 2013. And so I have a very colorful soil map here to show you. This isn't what they actually look like out in the field, but this is just sort of an illustration of one of the ways that we have matched our sites. So we have locations at, I mentioned those 2 different parks, but we wanted to make sure, obviously, that we're sampling in areas that are relatively well comparable to one another. So we've matched for things like soils, vegetation, and aspect within these stands. And on the screen here, there's 2 large sort of black square outlines. Those just signify the burn history, so 85 versus the compounding disturbance. And then the cross-hatched areas are smaller locations in each of the burns that we've matched for these other variables to make them comparable, essentially. So in each of those cross-hatched squares, we installed 10 randomly located long-term research plots. We mapped out the stand and took a host of different abiotic variable measurements. So we looked at soils, as I've mentioned a few times here. We did some soil sampling, looked at some soil profiles to sort of confirm similarities between sites, looked at percent understory light availability, and also collected seed and soil for a greenhouse experiment, which we just finished, and there's not a whole lot to report. Redwood doesn't sprout very well by seed. So we've got these sort of variables quantified. And I mentioned that there were 10 random samples in each of those areas. We have a total of 80 research plots. Ultimately, we want to answer some questions, and those questions are the ones that I posed a few minutes ago. First of all, we're looking at how do compounding disturbances and other fire disturbances in the redwoods influence the long-term trajectory of the stands in terms of structure, in terms of composition, and what do they look like for long-term resilience of redwood and other species. We've essentially in the last few weeks with the finishing up of the field season have mapped out some of the ways that the structure and composition sort of are different between our stands. On the left, in the 2 single burns from 1985 and 2008, you have a sort of more typical uneven age stand, a little bit higher diversity. We have redwood, we have tan oak, we have bay laurel. But in the 2013 and the compounding 1985 and 1999 burns, things are a bit more homogeneous. That blue there perhaps is a bit misleading. It's actually redwood that is shown there. But what we see is that the stands are much more homogeneous in terms of species composition and also fairly similar in terms of structure. The 2013 burn, of course, being a little bit more typical of an even age stand, and the 99 compounding disturbance being more of an irregular, uneven age stand. So we saw these sorts of patterns in the data looking at the results of the last 2 field seasons, and these are for stems that are greater than 2.5 centimeters. So there's a few actually that aren't listed on here. We had some that were in excess of 150 centimeters in diameter, but it was about 10 or so we cut them out. But looking at regeneration, the 0 to 2.5 centimeter class, what we see is that redwood is astronomically higher, both still in the compounding disturbance, which happened 16 years ago, and the 2013 burn history as well. So as you might expect, the more mature trees sort of mimic the regeneration that we see, but we think it's very interesting that the compounding history has a similar sort of stand structure and composition compared to the most recent burn, and that redwood, as we kind of heard in the previous presentation in terms of redwood being encouraged by fire, in our most recent and our compounding history, we see that redwood seems to be doing quite well, though tan oak not so much. And then, of course, the whole thing about soil legacies. What kind of imprints do we see from these fires and these burn histories over time? Do they vary at all, for example? So we looked at a few different nutrients that we thought would be important in these forests based off of other research in the Cupressaceae family, based off of other forest ecosystems. And so we have a total of 4 different nutrients that I'll just quickly show you. We chose phosphorus, calcium, nitrate, and ammonium for this work to basically look at their levels following these different amounts of time since fire, and then also to try to correlate them somewhat to redwood regeneration. With phosphorus, typically we expect to see increased levels of phosphorus for a year or more following fire. And what we see in these burn plots so far is that the 2013 burn is by far certainly not our highest year for phosphorus, and it's not statistically different actually from the furthest back, 1985 burn, nor from the 2008 burn. The 85-99 compounding disturbance, however, is statistically lower than anything else, which is interesting to me, but I have to admit I honestly don't have an explanation for why this compounding disturbance might have resulted in the across-the-board lowest levels of phosphorus that we see in all of our sites. So I personally would have expected it to be higher, more availability with these increasing number of burns, but perhaps one of you out there knows the answer to that, and I'd be happy to hear from you. So this is the first of the nutrients we looked at. Calcium, though, showed a little bit more of a typical response. You often see calcium increasing for 1 or more years following a burn, and actually I've seen recently a paper showing up to 20 years where they actually did look pre- and post-burn and were able to show that the burn was in fact the influencing factor for this. So we see that our 2013 burn has the highest levels of phosphorus out of any of the other areas that we've looked at. But if you look afterward, there's perhaps a little bit of step down to 2008, but the 85-99 burn doesn't really have any sort of different fingerprint, or however you want to think about this. And again, the 85 one is kind of doing its own thing a little bit higher than some of the other ones. So calcium is sort of showing what we would expect for these forests, and based on other research in forest fires and nutrient availability. Nitrate, though, a little bit different. We don't really see any statistical differences here. The 2013 burn is by far the highest, but these, so you can see here on the screen, the error bars show that there's enough variability within each of these years that we can't really distinguish between them statistically. So what we see is perhaps there was a little bit of a bump to nitrate. It typically lags behind ammonium in terms of availability, but there's nothing that we can definitively say, yes, this fire seems to have influenced 2013 to be higher in nitrate than any other burn year.
If I could quickly just interrupt, we have 2 trucks. I found one person in the other room, a black Toyota 6PSL 472. You're blocking the county courier. We can't unload the material.
It's not me. Is there anyone else?
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, and so we have ammonium levels next, the last of these nutrients, and we once again see that the 85 year is a bit of an outlier for us. The 1985 burn has the highest levels, despite the fact that ammonium does typically increase following a fire. Though it, as I mentioned, nitrate seems to lag behind it as ammonium is transferred into a nitrate form. So we see across the board here all these 3 burn years are essentially indistinguishable from one another. Interesting, unexpected, but certainly something that is useful to know. So to sort of summarize these 4 different nutrients, we see some patterns, especially with calcium, things that we would expect. But across the board, we can't really say, yes, compounding disturbance has this specific effect, or there's a certain sort of cascade year after year following these fires. Of course, though, what we want to know is how does this influence redwood regeneration, and what might this have in terms of an implication for future years and the forest stands into the future on these 4 sites. To answer that question, we built a model, a generalized linear model, for those of you who are familiar with the technique, to predict the amount of redwood regeneration using a few different variables. The first of those were those 4 nutrients I just mentioned. We included understory light as a variable as well, and we also looked at the burn history, of course, because we couldn't leave that out of the model here. And what we found was actually pretty surprising to us. We found that the only significant effect in this model was the burn history. And just to clarify, the way that these models are broken down, this isn't exactly saying that the 85-99 burn year is the only part of the burn history that's significant. We can't really essentially distinguish between the different years, but burn year itself was a statistically significant component of this model. But if you look at a little bit further down in this chart, the nutrients have no effect, and in fact, if they did, they would be quite insignificant in terms of actual impacts in the forest. So a bit of a surprise for us. We especially expected the direct light variable there to be important compared with other ecosystems, but there's questions and other modeling that will have to be done in order to tease out what's going on here. So to wrap up the messages from this research, the signals that we've gotten, we went out trying to find some sort of patterns from compounding disturbance and to be able to put this into something that we could use to understand the way that redwood regenerates, the way that stands change in terms of structure and composition over time. What we found is that there may be a relationship between these compounding disturbances and a more redwood-dominated forest or a more homogeneous stand structure and composition. But it's certainly something we'll have to look into the future in terms of other variables that may be influencing this. With calcium, we did see increases in the most recent burn year that matched what we know about calcium cycling after fires. With some of the other nutrients, we didn't really see that, and as I mentioned, there wasn't any specific fingerprints of a compounding disturbance on nutrient availability. And then lastly, we found that burn history was our only significant reliable predictor for redwood regeneration. So we have data for the other tree species that were on these sites, and we'll be modeling those in the future, and also working with the site managers and some other ecologists to basically discuss what we can include in the models that might explain more of this, because while we have sort of hypothesis tested here whether or not those variables are significant, we found that a lot of them aren't, and we want to know what else is going on here. How else can we predict this regeneration? So with that, I'd like to just quickly thank our funders. We have Cal Poly, ARI, the McIntyre Stennis Program, and of course Save the Redwoods League. And support from my committee and other researchers, volunteers we've had in the lab. I'd be happy to answer questions if there's time. Thanks.
Looks like we do have time for one question. Somebody would like to? Yeah, you.
Well, as you know, not all fires are created equal. Do you have any fire severity information from those original burns that went through and how that may factor in?
That's something that we've been curious about from the start. As you mentioned, all fires certainly are not created equal. We've talked to the site managers for each of our locations, and for example, Big Creek barely even had maps that we could reliably use to figure out where the burns were. There's a little bit of kind of journal data that Big Creek has in terms of fire movement and behavior, but we don't have a sort of reliable quantified metric for severity. We are looking at burn heights on trees and sort of noting some more qualitative differences, but that's one of the variables we'd like to be able to sort of hone down a little bit better in the future. Thanks.